beheer oor daardie noodsaaklike produksiefaktor grond te bewerkstellig, dateer sedert ten minste 1962. Grondongelykhede in Suid-Afrika veroorsaak dat grond 'n sleutelwigpunt kwessie is, wat met verloop van tyd gebruik kan word om eiendomsreg in die algemeen te verswak. Mislukkings in grondhervorming is tot dusver gebruik om huidige eise ten aansien van grondonteiening sonder vergoeding beide in die grondwet, sowel as in die wetsontwerp op onteiening van 2019 te wettig. Meeste Suid-Afrikaners dra min kennis oor die NDR en die media gee ook nie veel daaroor dekking nie. Nogtans is begrip hieroor uiters nodig om die propaganda te verstaan vir wat dit is, om die raamwerk waarbinne debat gevoer word te herdefinieer en beleidsaanpassings te beklemtoon wat kommersiële landbou ten beste sal bevorder, eiendomsreg vir almal sal verseker en politieke vryhede sal beskerm. Kortliks Dr. Jeffery se biografie. Sy het regsgrade in die universiteite van die Witwatersrand, Cambridge en Londen verwerf en sy is die hoof van beleidsnavorsing by die Instituut van Rasseverhoudinge. Sy het 12 boeke geskryf waaronder People's War, New Light on the Struggle for South Africa, as ook BEE, Helping or Hurting. Sy het verder ook wyd en breedvoerig geskryf oor omstrede onderwerpe soos grondhervorming, eiendomsreg, die mynsektor, die voorgestelde nasionale gesondheidsversekeringsstelsel en 'n groeigefokuste alternatief vir swart ekonomiese bemagtiging. Baie welkom by ons. Julle is welkom om vir haar vrae na afloop van haar toespraak in Afrikaans te vra.
Baie dankie. And many thanks for inviting me to talk to you today about the National Democratic Revolution and land reform. I'm going to deal with the topics you can see before you. We'll start with what is the NDR. The NDR, sorry, this doesn't go through. So to give you some sort of definition, how it relates to the land issues, what land goals were before 1994 and what they have been since then, land reform failures and how they have really helped to justify now the demand for expropriation without compensation. The recent report of the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture, which came out last week, problems and challenges with the NDR and land, what we can do to try and counter the NDR, and just a final point about property rights and how vital they are for freedom. Seems I'm going in the wrong way. So if we say what is the NDR, it's the second stage of a two-stage revolution. The first is to end colonialism, the second is to achieve socialism. And this NDR theory was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1950s, when there was a great decolonization process going place. Many African and Asian colonies were becoming independent, many of them with capitalist economies, and the Soviet Union wanted to take them gradually to socialism, to communism, and bring them under its wing. So it developed a strategy for doing that, and it's known as the NDR. It was hard to apply to South Africa because we had become independent from Britain in 1910, so we weren't a colony. But in 1950, the South African Communist Party came up with the idea of colonialism of a special type, in terms of which whites are the colonialists, blacks are their oppressed colony, and unusually they all live within the borders of the same country. The further consequence in NDR thinking is that white prosperity is purely the result of colonial oppression. It has nothing to do with education, with skills, with technological advances. And the advancement of the CST idea brought South Africa within the NDR framework. And the SACP and the ANC both went on to endorse the NDR. The SACP began in 1962 with its program called The Road to South African Freedom, where it identified key NDR tasks for the ANC to fulfill as being overthrowing the colonial state of white supremacy, Africanizing both the state and the private sector, isolating and suppressing whites who have the most capacity to wage the counter-revolution, take the land as an essential element. The ANC held its next national conference at Morogoro in Tanzania in 1969, and there it very much endorsed the SACP views. It accepted the CST idea, it resolved to implement the National Democratic Revolution, and it said it would do so very much on the basis of the Freedom Charter, a document drawn up in 1955, very much with Soviet help and reflecting the input of Communist Party people in South Africa. Part of the Freedom Charter's plan, as many people will be aware, is the call for the land to be redivided among those who work it. What is perhaps less well known is that the SACP sees the fulfillment of the Freedom Charter as the indispensable basis for the advance to socialism, not only in land, of course, but also in all its other spheres. And this has some immediate ramifications. That the ANC remains a liberation movement. It never sees itself as an ordinary political party. And it sees itself as having an historic mission to complete, in other words, the implementation of the NDR, and hence with a unique entitlement to rule. And since no opposition party shares that unique role, it regards opposition as fundamentally illegitimate. It also thinks that the Constitution is not really binding on it. It's a temporary compromise which it had to enter into in order to advance its long-term aims. Some rights in the final Constitution, which was drawn up by a Constituent Assembly in which the ANC had considerable influence, are useful to the NDR. Things like the socio-economic rights, but others are not, and those are to be white-anted and in time removed. A key element of the NDR right from the start has been to deploy loyal cadres to all levels of power, but these are seen as extending way beyond the public service to include the judiciary, the media, business, and civil society organizations. The NDR is a very ancient idea, having been developed in the 1950s, and yet it gets regularly reaffirmed. This is really because NDR thinking was hardwired into the ANC in its period in exile. The people who developed the NDR in the Soviet Union have long since scorned it. But the ANC took the view that when the Soviet Union fell, it wasn't because socialism was a bad idea, simply that it had been badly applied. In addition, the SACP still dominates the ANC, and it still sees the NDR as the most direct path to socialism and then communism. And it said so yet again this last week, commemorating its 98th anniversary. The ANC recommits itself to the NDR in its strategy and tactics documents at its 5-yearly national conferences. So most recently, it did so at Nasrec in December 2017. The NDR is often also endorsed by key ANC leaders, including Cyril Ramaphosa, of course Ace Magashule, and many in the top 6 and the National Executive Committee. But the media, unfortunately, still largely ignores the NDR, and it does the same in relation to the ANC's People's War, which was the first stage in the 2 stages of the revolution. And to my mind, you really do need to understand both. The ruthlessness of the People's War helps explain why the ANC can be so determined to implement the NDR, irrespective of the suffering it causes. When we come to the NDR and land, state control of land has always been a key ANC priority because land is a key means of production. In addition, in 2002, the ANC said that property relations are at the core of social systems. Obviously, you need private rights for free markets and state ones for socialism. In South Africa also, because of our history, the land injustices are real, and there's an important argument to be made that they need redress. So land can unfortunately also be used as a wedge issue. Support for land reform can be used to weaken property rights more generally. If we look at the land goals pre-1994, In 1962, the SACP talked of drastic land redistribution, said it was indispensable to socialism, talked about the need for peasant plots that would be collectivized, and about land ceilings on big holdings. In 1969, the ANC also talked about redistributing to peasants and small farmers and introducing land ceilings. And in the 1980s, the ANC's talk was very much about redistributing land to peasants and then collectivizing it on the transition to socialism. In 1989, the SACP, in its new program of action, said we have to focus on land to break the power of whites and the capitalist system. In post-1994, there's been a strong focus on land reform, as I'm sure we all know. In Section 25, the property clause in the Constitution, it sets out 3 prongs for land reform: redistribution, restitution, and tenure reform, all of which have failed. In the 2002 Strategy and Tactics document, the ANC spoke of the need to eliminate apartheid property relations. Apartheid suggests redress, but if you take that word out and substitute existing, which is more the intention, the picture is clearer. The ANC also said that this exercise requires dexterity in tact, by which they mean reassurances, likely to prove empty in the end, plus firmness in principle, a determination to proceed. We're now well into the second phase of the NDR, and in 2011 the ANC began talking about it being time to amend the Constitution. In 2011 we had a green paper on land reform, which talked about stolen land, about white farmers as foreign colonizers, spoke of the need for land ceilings and a valuer general to put a value on land targeted for land reform, said that black farmers should be allowed leasehold title only, not the ownership which some had previously gained, and that there should be limited land use rights in customary areas. In 2012 at the Mangaung Conference, the ANC spoke of the need for more radical action to confront the dominance of capitalism and attain economic freedom through aggressive land reform. Since then, we had in 2013 the State Land Lease and Disposal Policy, under which, exactly as the Green Paper foreshadowed, it's leases, not ownership, that go to black farmers, which really means that land reform is something of a fraud. The intention is not to transfer land from white people to individual black owners, but rather to transfer it to the state. In 2014, land claims were reopened and legislation on the valuer general was introduced. In 2014 also, a bill was put forward that would have vested the custodianship of all agricultural land, any land that wasn't classified as urban, into the state's custodianship. Sorry, I'm getting that. This was taken out, the custodianship idea was taken out in a 2016 bill, but it could well come back. The EFF wants it, and the ANC spoke of introducing it at Davos this year. In 2015, it came with a policy called the One Household, 1 Hectare policy, in terms of which a great deal of rural land is to be divided into 1 hectare plots, whether it's redistribution land, restitution, customary land, or land held in state custodianship. And then the households there will be organized in cooperatives, and then in secondary cooperatives, and will have stakes in the agri-parks which are being established. And on this happy vision, the state will provide these farmers everything that they need for success. In 2017, a bill was drafted that would have imposed ceilings on land holdings. Look at the land reform failures. In restitution in broad terms, we had something like 80,000 old claims, which may still need to be settled, 80,000 new ones, in other words, under the Act that was adopted in 2014, and a possible 400,000 to come. But the land doesn't go to individuals, it goes to communities and has communal ownership. And there's been a 73% failure rate on this transferred land, and it's mooted that it could take 700 years to complete the process and bring an end to uncertainty about the title of land which is under claim. Under redistribution, the state buys, it leases for up to 50 years to black tenant farmers who might then be able to buy, but their few successes evident and very few of these long leases apparent. The valuer general regulations were introduced in 2018. They are part of the law, and they introduce a formula for valuation under which you can quite easily get to 50% of market value as the appropriate value. The formula in essence requires you take the current use value of the property, which they get to by saying what are the profit and losses on a single day. In most cases that's very little. If it's your residential house they're talking about, it's likely to be slightly negative. Whatever that amount is, you add that to market value and divide by 2. So for most people, 50% of market value. And it's a parody of the normal valuation principles, which would look at profit and loss over 20 years. There's been little progress on handing out title deeds, which is the most important aspect of land reform. And Parliament, as I'm sure we all know, in December 2018, resolved that Section 25 does need to be amended. An ad hoc committee was established to take this process forward. It has just this last week been reconstituted post the 2019 election. Now, last week we had the report of a presidential advisory panel, and it actually put a big focus on expropriation, despite the positive spin that many journalists have used in talking about it. It did agree that Section 12 should be amended to allow EWC expropriation without compensation. It suggested the wording to be used for that constitutional amendment. If that is the wording adopted, it is extremely broad. It will make it possible to adopt almost any law, of course then by a 51% majority, because it will be ordinary legislation. It talks about nil compensation in 10 cases where land has been abandoned or where it's held purely for speculative purposes, but it also makes it clear that that list is not a closed one. The circumstances where you could have nil are not limited to those 10. It also says, and I think this is very important, that municipalities right across the country, urban and rural, should identify land for redistribution, which will then be acquired by donation, if you feel like making a gift of it, failing which there'll be negotiation. But if the negotiation doesn't lead to success, then this will lead to expropriation, which is a highly coercive approach to use. And the new compensation policy, which the panel thinks should be developed, would include a sort of spectrum of amounts. Compensation would range from 0 to minimal to substantial to market related, which might not, of course, be market value. The panel also said that redistribution of land should continue until demographic representativity is reached, that agricultural production should also be demographically representative, and it wants a big focus on household, subsistence and smallholder farms, which it thinks are much better than big commercial farms. And so it thinks that water rights should be shifted from the big commercial farms to these small ones as well, with the idea that they'll be more ecologically friendly. Perhaps further to discourage the big commercial farms, it says we need optimum land ceilings so that surplus land can be expropriated or punitively taxed. And to my mind, it sounds reminiscent of the one household, 1 hectare policy, though that is not mentioned. The idea that you should have any number of small producers working on land which is effectively owned by the state, acting cooperatively, and ultimately being linked to the new agri-parks. What about the financing of land reform? The panel really didn't put any numbers on it. The costs were not quantified. Of course, there'll be the costs of land acquisition, but those can be brought down in the mechanisms that I've described. There'll be a whole host of new institutions and probes and investigations and laws, which will be costly, particularly the ongoing institutions. And there will have to be extensive support for beneficiaries, which is of course required because it's the failure to give support explains why so many land reform beneficiaries have failed. It hints that all whites are morally obliged to help finance land reform because they benefited from our discriminatory past. And then it talks about a land tax, particularly on commercial farms, on donations, on land reform bonds to be issued by the land bank, on joint venture financing models, for example, where the banks might agree to give loans on preferential rates. But they also hint at prescribed asset rules. You may have seen quite a lot of talk in the newspapers recently about the possible introduction of prescribed asset requirements for pension funds and other financial institutions. And here we find really a similar idea, with the report saying that banks, pension funds and others should be mobilizing to fund land reform. Then if we look back a moment and say, what is it that we can do when land reform is so much part of the NDR? Part of the problem is very few people understand the NDR. They tend to see land reform in its own merits as something quite separate from the NDR. And it's difficult to understand it because it has many facets and most commentators overlook it, so you're not reading about it in the newspaper every day. The groups that are targeted by the NDR find it difficult to join the dots or to work together to overcome it. So farmers are being targeted, so are miners, so are people, the pharmaceutical companies that produce patented medicines, so now are the companies that run private hospitals under the NHI. But many of the targeted groups are also stigmatized. Sure, we're all aware of the stereotype of the abusive farmer, and this perhaps makes it harder for other people to speak up for them. And many topics have effectively been placed off limit. If you think of the extraordinary reaction that followed when Helen Ziller said that the ongoing consequences of colonialism were not only negative, it's made it almost impossible to have a debate about what colonialism achieved as well as what it destroyed. And the whole CST, or the colonialism of a special type idea, has also been effectively placed off limits. Then another problem is this, that it just doesn't seem logical, and people can't believe it, that the good ANC or the good side of it will destroy farming or mining or anything else for ideological goals. And because that seems so utterly illogical, the targeted groups tend to think that they can do better by negotiating behind the scenes with the sensible people that they can find in the ANC, and by being helpful, saying how they can help solve a problem like land reform, when of course it's not really successful land reform that the ANC SSEP are interested in. Increasingly, the targeted groups accept the terms of the debate as set for them by the ANC, and that puts them on the back foot. So if you're talking about land, the real issue, the real imperative, is not how fast we can transfer millions of hectares from their existing owners into the ownership of the state, where many of them might then fall out of production. The key issues rather are, what can we do to expand commercial farming? We must start by keeping the commercial farmers we have. We must make sure that this becomes an enterprise that many more people of all races can participate in. We must make communal land more productive. This is some often of the most fertile land in the country, yet it's hardly used for agriculture at all, and it won't be used in that way unless there's individual rather than communal title, and a great deal of support and infrastructure. The other huge challenge, much more important really, is what do we do to generate jobs and houses in the cities? We have a population that's already 65% urbanized, projected to be 70% urbanized by 2030, and that population has to be fed and housed. What is the likely road ahead if the NDR continues? That the EWC constitutional amendment will proceed, that the expropriation bill of 2019 will then be enacted. And again, there's been a lot of reassurance around that bill. People have been told it's nothing really to worry about. It only provides for no compensation in 5 instances, again, not a limited list. In fact, when you study it, the procedures it sets up are also extremely worrying, because you could lose your farm or your house or whatever, and then only afterwards have the right to go to court if you can afford it to try and fight. Expropriation will become far more common because it will often be done at less than market value. and there will be a damaging focus on small farmers to the detriment of the big commercial ones, and hence to the detriment also of food security, which as always will have its worst impacts on the poor. And in time, because this I think is the fundamental goal, the state could take custodianship of all land, which is at Davos is what it said basically that it wanted. And it would hope that the Constitutional Court would rule that this is not an expropriation, in which case zero compensation is payable. And that really rests on a judgment by Chief Justice Mogoeng back in 2013. He was dealing with a mining right, but he said the assumption of custodianship is different from expropriation, because expropriation, in a nutshell, requires the acquisition of ownership. So he seemed to think there was a big difference between custodianship and ownership, and if it's custodianship, then it's not expropriation, and if it's not expropriation, then there's no compensation. And that ultimately is the risk that people face. And why are property rights important to everybody, and absolutely not just to those who already own property? It was captured so well by Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. The system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but also for those who do not. It is only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently that nobody has complete power over us. I think we know the truth of that. We also know what can happen if the state has ever more of that complete control. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that insightful talk. Now the arena is over for some questions for Dr. Jeffery, see if there's any questions.
Can I ask a question? What other evidence is there of the NDR's implementation in South Africa since 1994?
Oh, I'm afraid it's a huge topic. The question of what evidence of the NDR elsewhere. I'm busy writing a book on it. I've got up to chapter 22, and each chapter takes a particular area, and it looks at what are the NDR goals in that sphere, what has been done to achieve them, and what is the consequence. So I've looked, for example, at Parliament, at the judiciary, at the whole question, obviously, of land, also at mining, at the reallocation of water, at labour, at the way in which a comprehensive social security system is being introduced, at education, healthcare, the whole view that the business is the enemy, the principal enemy of the NDR, and must be brought into line. At this point, not utterly destroyed, but rather its resources must be used to advance the NDR, very much with the idea that social needs must always take precedence over private profits. And that's what's happening now with the NHI, the National Health Insurance proposal, where a private hospital, for example, will be expected to continue functioning, to treat patients and charge them zero, and to accept whatever fees the state decides is appropriate for all the expenses that they incur in providing that treatment. And so it goes on. So it's a huge panoply of areas where the NDR is at work, and it all is aimed finally over a long period, 30, 40, if necessary 50 years, at taking us to a point where first the socialist sector is hegemonic, and then we can move to full socialism and communism.
There's a question?
Hello. So the state will run out of money at some stage, and there was talks about either using IMF or BRICS banks or pension funds. So they'll probably go for pension funds first, but that will run out at some stage as well. I mean, will they ever go for IMF funding? And what will be the consequence of that? Will that stop this or not?
Yeah. I think you're 100% right. They are, of course, running out of money, and they can talk about levying more taxes in order to fund the national health insurance, as they did yesterday. But it's hard to squeeze more taxes out of this rather small stone that constitutes this tax base. But there is something like 4.3 trillion gathered in pension funds, and that's a big pot of money, one of the biggest pension funds in the world. So yes, I do think that we will find increasing moves towards prescribed asset requirements, so that pension funds and other financial institutions, not just the pensions, become obligated to buy Eskom and other bonds, and perhaps to do things like fund land reform. Then there's also the whole question of printing money, and that's where the South African Reserve Bank comes in. And S. Magashule was rather laughed at when he talked about we must have quantity easing instead of quantitative easing. But fortunately, the Reserve Bank is in the hands of Anthea Kganyago. Fortunately, Cyril Ramaphosa has just reappointed him to his post for another 5 years, and he will fight hard for the independence of SARB. But he's up against, I think, a number of his colleagues, both the more pure leftists who really want the ideology to be carried through to its logical end, and the ideologues who are also looters, who recognize how much you can get along the way as the state takes control. So if we get to the point that the pension funds and the accumulated savings are not enough, we might find that the printing taps get turned on, as has happened in Zimbabwe, as we all know, with disastrous consequences. So in the end, we go to the IMF, and Zimbabwe had to give up the pretense of having its own currency back in 2008, and they're now trying again. We might ultimately have to. I think the Chinese have given a very strong message just recently that they are not willing to fund the ANC in a big way, and have said that, many countries have good relations with the IMF, sort of being code for, so don't look to us, but we might help you to go to them. It would make an enormous difference if they did go to the IMF, because the IMF would insist on a whole number of sensible reforms. It would really stop the NDR pretty much in its tracks. Mbeki was able to avoid having to go to the IMF back in 1996, when our debt metrics also looked very appalling. And he and Manuel devised quite a credible process of cutting state spending, boosting growth, helped of course by the commodities boom. But we don't have the sorts of options that he was able to rely on.
Dit is die laaste vraag.
What is the position of the IRR on the widening third world versus first world population gap? And I want to say exponential widening of that. We all know that third world thinking and communism goes hand in hand.
I'm not sure that we've done any particular thinking on it, I'm afraid. Obviously, the population of Africa is going to expand very rapidly between now and 2050, and then no longer, perhaps then the birth rate will come down, but there'll still be a growth. There are going to be huge pressures for migration. I think that what we see now is only a small part of it. And the key thing is really whether the kind of leftist thinking in the world will unleash the innovation that we will need to try and cope with that number of people in the world, or whether it will try and dump it down. And I'm sure you're aware that it's a sort of constant SACP claim that economic growth is simply destructive, that it's destroying our planet. And seriously, Leyden Zamande in their Congress documents in 2017 talked not only about the importance of farming on these small plots, etc., with the help of the state. He also said, and they must do what Cuba does. Cuba has this wonderful thing, they use the ox-drawn plow. And he said, we shouldn't see that as a step back into the past, that's a step forward into the 21st century. So there is that kind of anti-technology, anti-innovation mistrust in the left, the belief that growth and innovation cannot solve our problems, that we must rather hold everything down and then it will be better, back if we can return to some sort of halcyon past. I believe that we do have perhaps a principle of abundance which we can unleash with the right tools, but the politics must be right too if that's to be achieved.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jeffery, for this insightful talk. I'm sorry for there's no more time for extra questions, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the opportunity.